Students, in the last class we completed the respiratory system, muscle system, skeletal system, etc. Now we are discussing the remaining part, that is the excretory system, the reproductive system, development, nervous system up to the endocrine system. Now we have to discuss each and every question. As usual, regarding the each and every question we have to discuss some important bits. Now first of all we have to observe the first bit regarding the excretory system. Now the assertion, kidneys are the organs of homeostasis. Now you have to observe the question. Assertion, kidneys are the organs of homeostasis. Now as we observe the kidneys, the kidneys are analogous to that of contractile vacuole as well as the Malpighian tubules as well as the flame cells and chlorogogen cells. Students, again you have to observe the kidneys. Functionally, the kidneys are similar to that of contractile vacuole. In protozoans, contractile vacuole present. The contractile vacuole performs osmoregulation and excretion. Malpighian tubules are present in the arthropoda. They perform excretion and osmoregulation. The flame cells, they are present in the platyhelminthes. They perform excretion and osmoregulation. What about the chlorogogen cells? They are the present in the phylum Annelida. Their main function is excretion. Now as we observe the kidneys, these are the organs of homeostasis. What is meant by homeostasis? To maintain water and salt balance, that we call it as homeostasis. The kidneys are derived from ectoderm. The kidneys are made by nephric tubules. What are the structural functional units of kidneys? That we call it as nephron. Now the assertion is correct. Second one, reason, kidneys eliminate excess water and salts from the body. So it means, what is meant by homeostasis? To maintain water salt balance. It means the kidneys remove excess salts and water from the body fluids. Now both are correct. RE explains A. Now we go for the next question. Which of the following is true? Again you observe the question. Which of the following is true? Now we have to discuss the statements. All ureotelic animals. What are the ureotelic animals? They excrete urea. Students, you have to listen. What are the ureotelic animals? Ureotelic animals means they excrete urea. One example is the earthworm. The second example is elasmobranchi. And the third example is adult amphibians. And the last example is mammals. Now observe the first statement. All ureotelic animals are provided with mesonephric kidneys. In the body of earthworm, we should not mention mesonephric. In case of elasmobranchi, we have to explain the mesonephric kidneys. What about the adult amphibians? We explain mesonephric kidneys. What about the mammals? The mammals are ureotelic but having metanephric. So the first statement is wrong. Second, amnotelic vertebrates. What is meant by amnotelic? They excrete ammonia. They are called amnotelic. Amnotelic vertebrates are without kidneys. Now, what are the amnotelic vertebrates? The best example is fishes. Now as we observe the fishes, in the embryonic stage, pronephric kidney. What about in the adult stage? Mesonephric kidney. Second example, amphibians. In the amphibians larval stage, what type of kidney is present? the pronephric kidney. Now here what is the second statement? Amnotelic vertebrates are without kidneys. Wrong, because amnotelic vertebrates, one example is fishes, they are having what type of kidneys? Mesonephric. So second is wrong. Third, kidneys are retroperitoneal organs as they are covered by peritoneum on the ventral side. Now as we observe the kidneys, now this one we call it as the convexity of kidney, and this one we call it as concavity. Now this is ventral side. Here the V represents ventral side or concavity, and this is dorsal side or convexity. Now as we observe the kidneys, on the ventral side of kidney, what is present? The parietal layer present. The parietal layer. The parietal layer is also called the somatic layer. It is also called outer mesodermal layer. It is also called outer coelomic epithelial layer. Again you observe the words. Parietal layer also called somatic layer or outer mesodermal or outer coelomic epithelial layer. In case of kidneys, the parietal layer present only on the ventral side, so that the kidneys are called retroperitoneal organs. So that the third statement is correct. Next, renal fluid in the ascending limb of loop of Henle is. Now as we observe the parts of nephron, this one we call it as the proximal convoluted tubule. The proximal convoluted tubule opens into this one we call it as descending limb, and this part we call it as hairpin bend. This is called hairpin bend, and this one we call it as the ascending limb, and this one we call it as the distal convoluted tubule, and this one we call it as the collecting duct. As we observe the descending limb and hairpin bend, ascending limb and collecting duct, all these are present in the medullary pyramid. All these are present in the medullary pyramid. Now in the medullary pyramid, the tissue fluid is called medullary fluid. Now here the question is related to ascending limb. Now we observe the question again. Renal fluid in the ascending limb. This is called the ascending limb. The renal fluid in the ascending limb of loop of Henle is, that is hypotonic to the medullary fluid. We know very well hypotonic means it is less concentration than that of the concentration of medullary fluid. Now here the answer is hypotonic to the medullary fluid. What is meant by medullary fluid? The tissue fluid present in the medulla. Now the medulla appears to be pyramid, so it is called medullary pyramid. Now we go for the next question. Which of the following are confined to renal medulla? Which are following confined to renal medulla? Now you have to observe this part we call it as the cortex. C means cortex, and this one we call it as the medullary pyramid. The medulla is arranged in the form of medullary pyramid. Now this one we call it as the glomerulus. This is called the Bowman's capsule. The glomerulus Bowman's capsule present in the cortex, and this one we call it as the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal convoluted tubule present in the cortex. Now it opens into the descending limb. This is called the descending limb. It is present in the medulla. Now this one we call it as the hairpin bend. It is also present in the medulla. Now it opens into this one we call it as the ascending limb. Ascending limb also present in the medulla. Now it opens into the distal convoluted tubule. Now the distal convoluted tubule present in the cortex. Now this last part we call it as collecting duct. Now the collecting duct present in the cortex and also extends into the medulla. Now you have to observe this one, we call it as collecting duct. The collecting duct is going to start in the cortex and enters into the medulla. Now all collecting ducts are united to form the ducts of Bellini. The ducts of Bellini. Now based on this information, which of the following are confined to renal medulla? Now collecting ducts. Now these are collecting ducts. Collecting ducts not only present in the medulla but also present in the cortex. So the first one is not correct. Second, Malpighian body. Glomerulus and Bowman's capsule is called Malpighian body. That is present in the cortex. Second is eliminated. Peritubular network of capillaries. That is also present in the cortex but not represented in this diagram. And the last one we call it as ducts of Bellini. The ducts of Bellini present in the medulla, descending limb present in the medulla, ascending limb present in the medulla, hairpin bend present in the medulla. Now the correct answer is the fourth one. We go for the next question. In the kidney of rabbit, blood from the peritubular capillaries and vasa recta is collected by. Now as we observe the physiology of excretion, now this one we call it as the glomerulus, this one we call it as the Bowman's capsule, and this one we call it as the proximal convoluted tubule, and this part we call it as the descending limb, and this is called the ascending limb, and this is called distal convoluted tubule, and this is the collecting duct. Now we give the labeling: descending limb, ascending limb, collecting duct, distal convoluted tubule. Now this one we call it as the efferent arteriole. Efferent arteriole divides into capillaries. They unite and comes out as efferent arteriole. Now part of efferent arteriole divides into bunch of blood capillaries. Students, you have to observe the diagram. The part of efferent arteriole, this indicates the part. The part of efferent arteriole gives rise to peritubular network of capillaries. Now the peritubular network of capillaries associated with PCT and DCT. Now the remaining part of efferent arteriole gives rise to a bunch of blood capillaries, but they are in the U shape. Now again it is repeating. The remaining part of efferent arteriole, gives rise to U-shaped blood capillaries called vasa recta. Now you have to observe the capillaries of peritubular network of capillaries, the capillaries of vasa recta, they unite to form the renal venules. The renal venules comes out as the renal vein. Again it is repeating. Efferent arteriole gives peritubular network of capillaries as well as vasa recta. The capillaries of peritubular network of capillaries plus the capillaries of vasa recta unite to form renal venules. They unite and comes out as renal vein. Now you observe the question. In the kidney of rabbit, blood from the peritubular capillaries and vasa recta is collected by? The answer is venules, that is the renal venule, third option. Now we go for the next question. Match the following and choose the correct combination. First you have to observe the list 1 what they gave, and you observe the list 2. Now the first one, glomerular hydrostatic pressure. The next one is net filtration pressure, capsular hydrostatic pressure, blood colloidal osmotic pressure. Now this one we call it as the Bowman's capsule. This is the outer layer, this is inner layer, and this is we call it as the cavity of Bowman's capsule. Now this one we call it as efferent arteriole. Efferent arteriole divides into the bunch of blood capillaries. Now again the capillaries unite and comes out as efferent arteriole. Now in the efferent arteriole, what type of blood is passing? The arterial blood. In the arterial blood, what is more? Oxygen is more. The arrow mark indicates oxygen is more in the arterial blood. Now here, regarding the list 1, glomerular hydrostatic pressure. With the help of efferent arteriole, the oxygenated blood reaches the glomerulus. Now in the glomerulus, what is the hydrostatic pressure? That is 70 mmHg. Now this one we call it as the lumen of Bowman's capsule or the cavity of Bowman's capsule. Now it is filled with the cortical fluid or tissue fluid of the cortex. Now what is the pressure of fluid present in this capsule? That we call it as 25 mmHg. Now because of the proteins, the blood has a colloidal pressure, that we call it as 35. Now we are getting 60. Now what is the hydrostatic pressure? 70. Now 25 plus 35. Here what is the 25? Capsular pressure. What is the 35? That is osmotic colloidal pressure of blood. 25 plus 30 we are getting 60. Now what is the hydrostatic pressure? 70. 70 minus 60 we are getting 10. That we call it as net filtration pressure. Because of this, in the glomerulus, the blood is subjected to filtration. Now based on this information, the answer is second one. Now we go for the next question. Match the following and choose the correct combination. Now on one side we are giving the parts of nephron. Now the first one is, this one we call it as the proximal convoluted tubule. Now these are the walls of proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal convoluted tubule, it is permeable to water and permeable to the solutes. And now the proximal convoluted tubule opens into the descending limb, and these are the walls of descending limb. Now the descending limb is permeable to water as well as the solutes. Now this part we call it as the hairpin bend, and this one we call it as the ascending limb. This is called ascending limb. As we observe the ascending limb, this part we call it as thin part, and this part we call it as thick part. Now as we observe the ascending limb, it is impermeable to water. Now the thin part of ascending limb less permeable to the solutes, less, indicating arrow mark. Now the thick segment of ascending limb permeable to more number of solutes. the entire part of ascending limb impermeable to water. Now this one we call it as the distal convoluted tubule. It is permeable to water as well as solutes. Now you observe the first one is PCT, proximal convoluted tubule, thick segment of ascending limb and descending limb and thin segment of the ascending limb. Now based on this information, what is the correct answer? That is the fourth one. Now we go for the next question. Ureotelic. What is meant by ureotelic, students? The animals excrete urea called ureotelic. Those animals excrete urea called ureotelic. What are the examples for the ureotelic? One example is the earthworm and the second one is cartilage fishes and the third one is A means adult amphibians and the last example is all mammals. All these animals excrete the urea. Now here ureotelic, among the given examples, one is elasmobranchi or cartilage fishes, second adult amphibians, third all mammals, and next example is earthworm. Now go for the next question. Hormones help in the reabsorption of substances in the DCT. What is meant by DCT? This one we call it as the distal convoluted tubule. Now this we call it as RF. What is meant by RF? That we call it as the renal fluid. Now as we observe the DCT, it is permeable to water and permeable to solutes. Now here from the renal fluid, how much amount of water is reabsorbed? 9%. Here what type of hormone plays an important role? ADH. What is the meaning of ADH? Antidiuretic hormone, also called the vasopressin. Here with the help of hormone, water reabsorption takes place, so we call it as facultative reabsorption. Now here for the reabsorption of sodium, what type of hormone responsible? Aldosterone and antidiuretic. Now here hormones help in the reabsorption of substances, that is water as well as solutes, in the DCT, that is the distal convoluted tubule of nephron. One answer is vasopressin, also called antidiuretic hormone, and aldosterone. Now go for the next question. Assertion. Creatine is regarded as an A threshold. Now we are having a good idea: highly threshold, low threshold, A threshold. What is meant by highly threshold? They are necessary, they must be absorbed. What about the low threshold? They are absorbed in less quantity. What about the A threshold? They are not necessary for our body. So anywhere in the nephron, A threshold materials are not at all reabsorbed anywhere in the nephron. What is the best example for the A threshold? Creatinine. So that it is not at all useful for the body. So anywhere in the nephron, it is not reabsorbed. Those materials not necessary and not reabsorbed by the blood, that we call it as A threshold. Now creatine considered as an A threshold substance. Creatine is not at all reabsorbed in any part of the nephron, hence it is called A threshold. The answer is both are correct, or he explains A. Now we go for the next question. Now we discuss The next part from reproductive system to the endocrine system. Now we discuss the first question regarding this topic. Now the students, you observe the question. The seminiferous tubules are internally lined by. Now this part we call it as the testes. T means testes. Now as we observe the testes is divided into number of compartments. Now these are called the septa and these are called compartments. Now in each compartment what is present? The seminiferous tubule. Now the seminiferous tubule is lined inside by germinal epithelium. Now the cells of germinal epithelium undergoes reduction division. Here the reduction division is called the spermatogenesis. After completing the reduction division, we are getting the haploid sperms. Now these dots indicate the haploid sperms. Now what is the site of spermatogenesis or reduction division? Answer is seminiferous tubule. Where haploid spermatozoa formation takes place? Seminiferous tubule. Each seminiferous tubule lined inside by what type of epithelium? Germinal epithelium. Now the answer is the third one. Now we go for the next question. Chorda epididymis is connected to scrotal sac. Now as we observe the male reproductive system, this part we call it as the testes, we know very well. Now on one side of testes, highly convoluted tubule present. This is called epididymis. Okay students. On the lateral side of testes, highly convoluted tubule present. This is called epididymis. It is classified into caput epididymis, corpus epididymis and chorda epididymis. Now this entire testis is present in a sac. This one we call it as the scrotal sac. This one we call it as the scrotal sac. Now the chorda epididymis attached to scrotal sac by a tissue called gubernaculum. Now the testes posteriorly attached to scrotal sac by a tissue called gubernaculum. The testes anteriorly attached by spermatic cord. Now spermatic cord attached to caput epididymis, gubernaculum between scrotal sac and chorda epididymis. Now here the answer is gubernaculum. Now we go for the next question. Urethra. What is the urethra? Urinogenital canal. Now we have to observe urethra of male rabbit passes through. Now this one we call it as the copulatory organ. This part we call it as the copulatory organ. Now in the copulatory organ, 3 longitudinal muscle columns are present. Now these are 3 longitudinal muscle columns. Now as we observe the transverse section of copulatory organ, this is dorsal side and ventral side. Dorsally corpora cavernosa and ventrally corpus spongiosum is present. Now corpora cavernosa and this is corpus spongiosum. Now what is the urethra? Urethra is nothing but urinogenital canal. Now this indicates the urinogenital canal. Now this dot indicates urinogenital canal. Now here urinogenital canal present in what type of muscle tissue? Corpus spongiosum. Now what about the corpora cavernosa? In the corpora cavernosa, what are present? The empty blood spaces are present. Now whenever the animal gets sexual excitement, the empty blood spaces are filled with blood. Now the question is, urinogenital canal or urethra enclosed in what type of muscle tissue? The answer is corpus spongiosum. Now we go for the next question. The bulk of the seminal fluid is contributed by the secretions of. Now as we observe the male reproductive system, what are the accessory glands associated with male reproductive system? One we call it as seminal vesicle, second one we call it as prostate gland, third one we call it as Cowper's glands, and the next one we call it as rectal glands. Again repeating, seminal vesicle 1 in number, prostate gland 1 in number, Cowper's glands 2 in number, rectal glands 2 in number. But the function of rectal glands is not known in male as well as female. Seminal vesicle present in male, prostate gland present in male, Cowper's glands present in male. Now here the question, bulk of seminal fluid. What is meant by bulk? More and amount of seminal fluid come out. For the formation of more and more amount of seminal fluid, what type of accessory glands secretions play an important role? The answer is the prostate gland. Now we go for the next question. Vaginal acidity is neutralized by the secretion of. And now as we observe the copulation, at the time of copulation, the male animal inserts copulatory organ into the vagina of female animal. And now in the vaginal cavity acidity present. If acidity present, the sperms are going to die. So that in order to neutralize the acidity in the vaginal cavity, what type of glands secretions play an important role? That we call it as the Cowper's glands. The Cowper's glands present only in the male animal. Number of Cowper's glands 2. In case of female, Cowper's glands are absent. Now here the answer is the Cowper's glands. Now we go for the next question. The glycoprotein membrane around the ovum in rabbit. Now as we observe the ovum, this part we call it as the ovum. In the ovum, haploid number of chromosomes are present. The ovum is covered and protected by how many layers? 2 layers. Innermost layer we call it as zona pellucida. Above what is present? A striated layer is present. Now it is called the corona radiata. Corona radiata. Students, again you have to observe the ovum covered and protected by how many layers? 2. Outer layer is corona radiata. At the time of fertilization, this layer disappears. Name the layer that adheres the ovum for a long period. Zona pellucida. It is made by glycoproteins. Whenever it is going to disappear at the time of implantation. Now here the answer is glycoprotein made layer around the ovum in the rabbit is the zona pellucida. Now we go for the next question. The trophoblast cells above the region of formative cells. Now, as we observe the development, in the development we have to observe the blastocyst. In case of mammals, we use the word blastocyst. In remaining animals, we use the word blastula. We know very well. Now, as we observe the blastocyst, now this one we call it as the outer trophoblast cells. Now these are called the trophoblast cells. You observe the diagram. Now these are the trophoblast cells. Trophoblast cells. Now, on one side of trophoblast, what are present? The formative cells. The formative cells also called inner cell mass. Now this is inner cell mass or formative cells. Now you observe, this is arrow mark. That is the dorsal side of formative cells. This arrow mark indicates the ventral side. Now here you observe the question, the trophoblast cells above the region of formative cells. All these are formative cells. Above formative cells, the trophoblast cells, these are called the cells of rubber. What are the cells of rubber? Nothing but trophoblast cells present above or dorsal side of formative cells. What is the other name of formative cells? Inner cell mass. What is the shape of formative cells? Polyhedral. Now based on this information, what is the correct answer? The cells of rubber. Now we go for the next question. Route for passage of sperms in rabbit. Rete testis, seminiferous tubules, vasa efferentia, epididymis. Now, this question is many times repeated in the main EAMCET examination. What is the passage of sperms? Now, this one we call it as the testes. Inside the testes, what are present? Seminiferous tubules. Now, you observe the diagram. Inside the testes, many seminiferous tubules. Ma means many. Now, all seminiferous tubules unite to form a network-like structure. Now, this one we call it as the rete testes. From the rete testes, what will arise? Many vasa efferentia. Now, the vasa efferentia unite and comes out as vasa deferens. Now, this part is present in the epididymis. Now, in the seminiferous tubules, what are going to develop? The sperms. Now, here the asking question is, what is the passage of sperms? Now, the sperms passing from seminiferous tubules, rete testes, vasa efferentia and epididymis. From the cauda epididymis, what will come out? The vasa deferens. That means the vasa deferens located in the epididymis. So that here seminiferous tubules, rete testes, vasa efferentia and epididymis. Now we go for the next question. Match the following and choose the correct answer. Now you observe the list one. One is parturition. The second one is micturition. The third one is implantation. And the fourth one is the ultrafiltration. What is meant by parturition? Now, as we observe the female, in the mother uterus, the embryo develops. After completing the gestation period, the baby will come out. The process of birth of baby, we call it as parturition. Now, in case of rabbit, what is the gestation period? 31 days. In case of opossum, the gestation period is less. In case of rat, the gestation period is 21 days. In case of elephant, the gestation period is near about 2 years. And in case of human being, what is the gestation period? 9 months. After completing the gestation period, the baby will come out, that we call it as birth. The birth we call it as parturition. Second, micturition. Now here the urinary bladder present. Whenever the urinary bladder is filled with urine, the information goes to brain. The brain gives motor impulse to the receptors of urinary bladder. Now urinary bladder undergoes contraction, we pass urine, that we call it as micturition. What about the implantation? Now as we observe the mother uterus, this one we call it as mother uterus. In the mother uterus, the embryo attached. The process of attachment of embryo to the mother uterus, that we call it as implantation. What about the ultrafiltration? Ultrafiltration going to occur in the glomerulus. After ultrafiltration, what is the result? That we call it as the RF. RF means the renal fluid. Now based on this, the answer is third. Now we go for the next question. Now again, match the following. List 1. Outermost covering of ovum, layer below the outermost layer, layer surrounding the ovum, layer surrounding the zona pellucida. Now as we observe the female reproductive system, now this one we call it as the Graafian follicle. This one we call it as the Graafian follicle. Now it is covered and protected by theca externa, and it is followed by the theca interna, and it is followed by the membrana granulosa. Membrana granulosa. Now this one we call it as a fluid filled cavity antrum, and this one we call it as the discus proligerus, a nutritive material. Discus proligerus. First one is theca externa, theca interna, membrana granulosa. On one side what is present? A cavity antrum, and followed by discus proligerus. Now this one we call it as the corona radiata. It is striped corona radiata. It is followed by glycoprotein layer zona pellucida, and this one we call it as the ovum. Now based on this information, theca externa, theca interna, externa followed by interna, followed by membrana granulosa, followed by a cavity antrum, followed by nutritive material discus proligerus, followed by corona radiata, followed by zona pellucida, and this one we call it as the ovum or egg. Now we go for the next question. Following are the developmental stages in the rabbit. Following are the developmental stages in the rabbit. Now the sperm and ovum undergo fertilization. Because of the fertilization we are getting the zygote. Now the zygote undergoes cleavages. CLE means cleavages. After cleavages we are getting the first stage of development, morula. Now the morula becomes blastula, but in mammals we call it as blastocyst. Now it is the second stage of development, that we call it as blastocyst. Now in the blastocyst one stage we call it as discoblastula. Now in the discoblastula stage you have to observe the diagram. Now in the discoblastula stage, now these are called the trophoblast cells. Students, this is the short word, trophoblast cells, and this one we call it as the formative cells. Now, from the formative cells, some cells separate. That process we call it as delamination. Because of the delamination, we are getting extra embryonic endoderm. That we call it as the hypoblast. Now here, what is the arrangement? Zygote undergoes cleavages, getting the morula, blastocyst, one stage of blastocyst, discoblastula. Here, from the formative cells, some cells get separate, called delamination. We are getting extra embryonic endoderm, also called hypoblast. Now, after completing the development, the baby will come out. That process we call it as birth, technically called parturition. Now we go for the next question. Read the statements in the development of rabbit. Now here, what is the first statement? Inner cell mass. Now this is inner cell mass. Inner cell mass represents totipotent cells. That is wrong, because in the animals, what type of cell having the totipotency? Only zygotic cell. Students, again you have to observe in the animals what type of cell has the power of totipotency? Only zygotic cell. Only zygotic cell. But here what they are giving, the inner cell mass is called totipotent cells. That is the wrong. Second, zona pellucida. That means the ovum covered and protected by innermost layer, zona pellucida. Whenever it disappears at the time of implantation. The second statement is correct. Third, neural plate develops from the notochordal rudiment. Now, what is meant by notochordal rudiment? That is the primitive form of notochord. Now, this one we call it as the notochord, and this one we call it as elementary canal. Now, above notochordal rudimentary, what are present? The neuroectodermal cells are present. Neuroectodermal cells. Now, all these cells unite to form the neural plate. Now, from these neuroectodermal cells, we are getting what type of structure? That we call it as the nerve cord. Now you have to observe the nerve cord develops above the notochordal rudimentary from what type of cells? Neuroectodermal cells. Now the neural plate develops above the notochordal rudiment. You have to observe the diagram. This is notochord. Above that, what is present in neural plate? From this, what is going to develop? The nerve cord and its components. Now we go for the next question. The important character of placental mammals. Now, what is meant by true placenta? What is meant by true placenta? Now I am giving a rough diagram. Now this one we call it as the mother. MO means mother, and this one we call it as the mother uterus. Inside the mother uterus, this one we call it as placenta, and this one we call it as the embryo. The embryo attached to mother uterus by a connecting link called placenta. Now in case of eutheria, what type of placenta is present? True placenta. What is meant by true placenta? It is made by chorion and allantois. Chorion and allantois. If the placenta is made by chorion and allantois, it is called the true placenta. Now here what they are asking? The important character of placental mammals, the transverse band of nervous tissue connecting two cerebral hemispheres. Now this is one cerebral hemisphere, and this is another cerebral hemisphere. This is cerebral hemisphere. This is cerebral hemisphere. Now these two combinedly termed as cerebrum. Now in the cerebrum, how many hemispheres? 2. Now in case of placental mammals, the two cerebral hemispheres connected by a transverse nervous tissue that we call it as corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is clear in case of eutheria. Eutheria is called true placentalia. Now we go for the next question.